Last week I mentioned that I wanted to create my own workshop space, a clean space which is organized and equipped for me to work on my bike, and maybe some friends' bikes. Well, this week I started. I very simply needed to make a partition wall to separate one section of the existing workshop, and there were a few things in the way which needed to be removed first, but more concerning than that is that I've never built a wooden wall before. So, like every great explorer before me who began a long journey, I set sail with only the hope of reaching my destination. To begin with, I wasn't too bad at taking things apart and reducing them to redundant bits and pieces. However, the proof of the pudding will be in the building of the wall of it. Totally nailed that analogy. My first complicated task was to remove this metal bracket thingy, which I only found out later held one of the roofing trusses in place and shouldn't be removed at all. But rest assured, as soon as I found out, I told someone. Now that the area where the wall would go was free and clear, I moved some clutter out of the way and measured up where I'd place my timber frame construction. Then I sharpened my pencil like a normal person and set out the laser level to give my wall a fighting chance of standing up straight. I knew I wanted a doorway in this area as it would make moving between workshops much easier. So I set the first frame to give me enough depth for a worktop on the rear wall should I ever need it in the future. My plan was to make a bunch of timber frames which could be fastened together and clad with some rough cut timber to give it a great workshop-y feel. Even though it already is a workshop, and who's to say how a workshop should feel? Okay, I'm spiraling. So a quick 24-hour wardrobe change later and the first frame was going in. The rest of the space would need to be divided into two sections so I could actually move each of the frames on my own. The obvious point being, if I made one giant frame, I'd not be able to move it into position. So since it's kind of more of the same, let's go into time-lapse mode and get our woodwork on. Now, at this stage of my woodworking career, I feel I'm totally qualified to offer some advice. Occasionally you get a wonky bit of lumber, and this doesn't make for nice square frames. So get a G-clamp and add a bit of leverage to persuade your otherwise awkward timber into position before fixing it. The first of the two frames could now be maneuvered into place, starting from the wall at the front of the workshop. It needed to be squared up first before joining the second frame to it, otherwise I'd be stuck trying to move one giant frame again. The second one would butt up against it, and by default create the door opening on the opposite side. And because the floor wasn't exactly true, I had to hold it together with clamps before fixing it in place. The next, more permanent step is to fasten the frames to the walls and the floor with some raw bolts. The next job on the list, and arguably one of the most important, is the workbench or worktop. I wanted to use the full length of the board as I had the space, and the only cut I wanted to do was straight down the middle. This worked out perfectly because this board standard size was exactly double the width of a standard workbench top. But before I could start any of it, I needed to find my pencil. No idea why this keeps happening to me. So I sharpened my pencil like a normal person and drew some important lines on things. I was running low on timber supplies and the nearest lumber yard is an hour and a half round trip, so I split this beam in order to make the frame for my workbench. But as I was yet undecided on how exactly I'd like to clad my wall, I needed to sit and think, but all I could think about was melted cheese. The melted cheese helped me decide that I was going to place my cladding to rest on top of my workbench. This meant I'd have to cut and install the workbench first before starting on the cladding. Now I could lower the worktop into place, and that would give me the starting point for my cladding.
Toma.
I didn't want to use rough cut timber under the workbench as it's expensive and time consuming to install. Besides, I like the fact that there's now a distinct separation on the wall, and it makes the rough cut timber above the workbench a little more of a feature. I also chose to use 45-degree braces instead of legs under my workbench, as it's guaranteed to be something I'll smash my legs into over time, and I don't intend to put a ton of weight on top of the bench. Speaking of the top of the bench, I wanted to cover it with something hard-wearing and industrial. I had this old piece of factory conveyor belt which would be perfect here. The only trouble is that it weighs 50 times more than you'd expect it to, and it had been sitting outside for years and needed a good scrubbing. The next thing I wanted to do was put up a large shelf, which would serve two functions essentially. One, it would create a place to install some downlighting for over the top of the workbench, and secondly, it would create some much needed space for storage and display. Over the top of the workbench, I installed these little trays which would come in handy for tiny useful knickknacks from time to time. Things like rolls of tape, cable ties, valve caps, or lubricant spray. From there, I was almost done with this phase of the project, and one of the last things to do was lay down some additional rubber flooring to fill out the work area. I'm really pleased with how it all came out, and I hope to spend a ton more time in here working on my bike and others' bikes too. It also has a second function. I hope to be filming some more videos from my new HQ, so if you have any suggestions, please feel free to leave a comment below. Thanks again for watching, and please subscribe if you'd like to keep up with things here, and I hope to see you again real soon.